My name is Ken Winter, and I'm a veteran of the U.S. Navy. I served on the aircraft carrier Midway. I was a seaman first class signalman. I joined in September the 2nd, 1944, and was discharged on July the 2nd, 1946. I was born in a little town in central Illinois, Chenoa, Illinois, in November 4th, 1926, which makes me 87 years old at the present time. Before the service, I was a student in high school and a mailman, and my family had a family restaurant, so I learned to be a chef and a waiter and so forth in the restaurant. My dad was in Air Force One. He was a chef, and my mother was a pie baker in the restaurant. My entry into the Navy is an interesting sort of story. On Pearl Harbor Day, December the 7th, 1943, my mother and I were in Chicago, and we were up in the top of the Tribune Tower, and when we got in the elevator to come down, there was a lot of activity in the Tribune Tower. There's reporters and writers going in and out of the elevators on every floor, and I finally asked them, I was 15 years old, and I asked them what the activity was all about. And they said that Pearl Harbor had been attacked by the Japanese. And I looked at my mother and I said, "Where's Pearl Harbor?" And she said, "I don't have any idea." And so they explained where Pearl Harbor was and a little bit about the attack. Said, "Well, you're going to read about it all in the paper in about 2 hours when it hits the streets." So I said to my mother, "Gee, I wonder if the war will continue until I'm old enough to get in it." And you know, boys don't realize how terrible war can be. And my mother had tears in her eyes because my dad had been in World War I, and she had lived through World War I, and she was fearful of us being in another huge conflict like that. So when I got home that day, I said to my dad, "I'm going to join the Navy." And he said, "Well, you're only 15, they won't take 15-year-olds. So I said, "Well, when can I join the Navy?" And he said, "If you join before you're 18, you have to have your parents sign the papers." And I said, "Will you sign the paper?" And he said, "Soon as you graduate from high school," which was a smart thing. And so when I graduated, the day after the graduation, he signed the papers for the Navy. And I got to go in to boot camp at Great Lakes, which is north of Chicago, Illinois. And I was in boot camp for 10 weeks, and then I was in for 4 months in signalman school. Signalmen at that time were the ones on ships and on land who sent messages with the Morse code by blinker light. We also learned flag hoist, which is those colorful flags you see on the masts of ships. Those are coded flags, and they direct the course of the Navy, and also had to learn semaphore. Semaphore is kind of an interesting thing. Most people don't know what it is. I think a lot of Boy Scouts used to learn semaphore for one of their merit badges. I also played in the Navy band at Great Lakes. I was a musician before I went in, My childhood, being in this small town in Illinois, incidentally, it's fascinating that kids, everybody was safe in those days. I'm talking about over 80 years ago. And kids could run free all over town. And if it became mealtime, or if it was time for something more important to let your parents know where you were, everybody in town would call your parents and tell them that, well, Ken is here. They called me Kenny in those days when I was little. Never liked that after I got older. And everybody took care of you. So what is that thing about a village? Well, the village was really important. I always liked music, and I don't know how young I was when I first liked music, but I can remember at least when I was 3 years old. I don't know, I probably can go back farther than that, but when I was 3, I loved music. Now, and most of the music I heard in those days was jazz and swing from the big bands and musicians of that period. And I'm talking about in the late 30s and the 40s. I was born in 26, so I'm talking about music that I heard and listened to and loved even before 1930. I used to go down to the high school, which was only about a long block from our home, and listen to the high school band practice. And they practiced across the street from the school in the basement of the Baptist church. They had windows that were hinged to the top, and they swung up, and they hooked them to the rafters. And I would lie there on the grass and stick my head in the window and listen to the band practice all the time. In the summertime, they would go out onto the highway or the road and practice marching and their formations and so forth. And so I'd get to see them do that. And the tuba player, sousaphone player, was the biggest kid in school. And of course, I thought he was an adult. He was probably 17 years old. And he played the tuba. Now, tuba is the sousaphone is a tuba that has the big bell, the huge bell. You put it on your shoulder. And so one day they were taking a break from marching, and he said, "Kenny, would you like to play the tuba?" And I said, "It's too heavy. I can't pick it up. I'm only 4 years old." So he said, "I'll take care of that." So he set it on the ground and he said, "Crawl in there, put your mouth on the mouthpiece, and play the tuba." And there's what I looked like at that time. So I was, incidentally, if you look at this picture, you'll notice my fingers are on the keys. I watched him and I just followed what he was doing. So he said, "Now blow." And I blew a blast on the tuba. Blow. And the lady across the street saw me, and she ran and got her camera, came over and took this picture of me. This is one of the greatest pictures, I think, that anybody ever took. So that's the way I started with music. The lady took the picture. Her brother, one of her brothers, was a musician. He had a band. He had 3 different bands, in fact. They played dances with swing music and the kind of music that the big bands played. They had a country band, so they could play for square dances and so forth. And then he had a small group that was, we would call it like a jazz group today. This was pretty primitive. This was back in the 30s, 1930s. And so when he retired, decided not to play music anymore, he gave me all of the music of his bands, the music for every part in the band, the saxophones, trumpets, trombones, piano, every instrument, and he gave them to me. Some of these were really priceless manuscripts, and that's when I started a band when I was in high school, a dance band, a swing band. And so I started with his catalog of music, and then I continued to buy music and keep up to date on things. So, we played all that music that the big bands played. We didn't have a 13 to 16 or 17 piece band. We had an 8-piece band, but we still played the swing music and the jazz of that day. The Navy sent me then, after signalman school, to Newport, Rhode Island. Newport, Rhode Island was a huge Navy base, and they used it sometimes for pre-commissioning cruises. And I was on a pre-commissioning complement that was waiting until the USS Midway, the aircraft carrier, was finished in Newport News, Virginia. That's just across the water from Norfolk. Then we, interesting, having been a music lover, while I was in Newport for the whole summer of 45, I got to go to New York and Boston on leaves, frequent leaves, and I went down to hear the big bands. They had usually 8 or 10, 12, sometimes 15 different bands in New York, so I would go down and spend all my time going from one theater to another, listening to the big bands. Those days they had a stage show with marvelous performers, and then a movie, and then the big band. And that continued all day long until 1 o'clock in the morning. I would hear some of the most famous bands of the time, Benny Goodman, Tommy Dorsey, Jimmy Dorsey, Woody Herman, bands of that nature, Duke Ellington, Les Brown. Then in the evening, we would go to lounges and bars to hear music. They would let, even though I was only 18 years old at the time, they would let us into the bars and the lounges to hear the music. In fact, they would serve you drinks in New York when you were 18. And so I got to hear a lot of smaller groups in restaurants and bars, like the 400 restaurant. They always had a big name band there. I had some interesting menus from the 400 restaurant, because in those days they had the price administration that set the prices, the ceiling prices on things. And strangely enough, a drink, for example, like a martini or Manhattan or so forth, was 37 cents. Today you pay $8 to $10 for the same kind of a drink. They also had great dinners, and the most expensive dinner was lobster. Not just a lobster tail, but the full lobster. As I recall, it cost $2.25 for a lobster dinner. I love lobster, and I still do. So those were interesting days. Those menus were huge. They had a big full picture, head picture of people on like my menus. I have some Benny Goodman, Charlie Barnett, let's see who else, oh, Tommy Dorsey. So those things to me were quite interesting for leaves from the Navy. I never would have got to do those things coming from a little town in central Illinois if I hadn't gone in the Navy. I owe the Navy a lot, and especially a lot of those pleasures. Being on the ship, of course, was a lot of fun because I really wanted to go into the aircraft, Army aircraft, and I couldn't do that. You had to have college training and so forth. And so the Navy was the next best thing. And then I was lucky to get assigned to an aircraft carrier because every day we had air operations. And having 100 and some planes on a ship that size, I got to stand on the signal bridge where I worked, and I got to watch the air operations. That for me was very exciting. In fact, the most exciting thing I ever did in my life, maybe other than the honeymoon, my most exciting experience was flying on and off the deck of the aircraft carrier in a helldiver. There's no way to describe the exhilaration of that. Only people who fly and have had experiences in the air can appreciate what those Navy pilots went through. Incidentally, we did, even in peacetime, we lost a number of planes because of things such as the conditions of the wind, the plane failing and so forth. And they always, of course, went into the ocean when they crashed. And so I did an important job of helping to rescue these guys, pinpoint where they were and so forth, so that the plane or our destroyer, we had 3 destroyers operating with us, they could go and pick up these pilots. So that was quite an exciting thing. In the Navy, after I got on the ship, we did a shakedown cruise. That's the first cruise that the ship ever is out in the ocean operating, to see how it works and see how the crew work. Shakedown cruise was at Guantanamo, Cuba. Guantanamo Bay. We still own Guantanamo, which is quite often in the news because the prisoners of this war, Iraq and Afghanistan, are based down there in a prison. So Guantanamo was interesting. And then one time we went to Trinidad. Trinidad is an interesting island just off of South America, off of Venezuela. And you heard a lot about that in World War II with the song about Trinidad. The Rum and Coca-Cola was the name of the song.
If you ever go down Trinidad, they make you feel so very glad. Calypso sing and make up rhyme, guarantee you one real good fine time. Drinking rum and Coca-Cola, go down Point Cumana, both mother and daughter that's a fact. From Chickacary to Mona's Isle, native girls all dance and smile. Help soldier celebrate his leave, make every day like.
And so that was quite an experience. The weather, of course, was from 80 to 100 or 105. And then the war ended, and so they sent us on an operation called Operation Frostbite. When the war ended, we thought that we might possibly be in a war with Russia someday, the Soviet Union. And so they sent our carrier and our 3 destroyers that were running plane guard, sent us up to the North Atlantic. And so here I went from 100 and some degrees up to the North Atlantic, north of the Arctic Circle. And I had the experience then of seeing big icebergs. Some of them were big as ships, and going through the ice flow, the ice fields. And it was quite a dangerous time, especially for planes. We wanted to find out if planes could operate in a severe climate like that. In case we ever went to the Soviet Union and had to fight or whatever. And so we lost several planes on that trip up to the Arctic Circle because we had huge heaters that they put a huge blanket over the engine of the plane and heated the engine for 30 minutes to 45 minutes before they had flight operations. Unfortunately, sometimes a plane would take off, a Helldiver or a Corsair or a Hellcat would take off on the deck of the ship, and if the engine missed one time, the plane went into the water. That was a sad time because we lost several pilots. Usually we were able to pick up the pilots, but in a couple of cases the plane went down instantly. One of the most interesting events was when I was on the signal bridge. A Helldiver went into the water and right in front of the bow of the ship, and we had a young quartermaster. Quartermasters are the ones that guided the ship with the big wheel, and this quartermaster was smart enough. He spun the wheel as hard as he could to the left, going to the port side, and the ship missed the plane that was in front of it in the water, and he immediately spun it to the right, the starboard side, and the ship made an S movement around that plane, and we didn't hit it. If we'd hit the ship, they would have gone down past the ship and through the propeller and would have killed the pilot and the radio gunner. And when the radio gunner got out of the plane, the pilot was knocked unconscious because of the gun sight in front of his head, and the radio gunner got him out of the plane instantly. They were standing on the wing of the plane and inflated a life raft. And as we went past, this was only like a couple of minutes later probably, when we went past them, I waved to him down there, which was like 75 feet down to the water, and he waved back at me. I never forgot that. when I was asked to come down to the Midway, which now is a museum in San Diego, all of the original crew that could come, I think we had about 38 people, as I recall, that went down there a few years ago, and they asked me about some of my experiences, and I told them about that. Lo and behold, the pilot was there, and he said, "That's exactly what happened." He said, we were so fortunate, because usually with a heavy plane like the Helldiver, if it didn't land flat in the water on its belly, we were gone. And so I owe my life to the radio gunner that stepped out on the wing of the plane and pulled me out of the cockpit. I thought that was, well, it was very exciting when we saw that happen. It was always great when we pulled a pilot out of the water and celebrated their life. And it was a sad time when we sometimes had memorial service on the ship for the pilots. So anyway, the Midway was interesting primarily for all those things that we did. I was on the Midway when the war ended, and talk about a lot of celebration. That was some kind of an experience to know that nobody else was going to be killed, and that there was going to be peace. We thought there would be peace forever. Now, unfortunately, as everybody knows, we had some terrible experiences with Korea and Vietnam and Iraq and Afghanistan. It's a sad thing that people, especially in certain countries, think that they have to have war all the time. So I'm not an isolationist, but I do think that we devote too much time sometimes to the Middle East. It seems like they've been in war ever since history began, and probably they're going to continue being at war. And that's a sad thing. Incidentally, talking about the Midway, if anybody gets a chance to go see the Midway Museum in San Diego, it's one of the finest museums I've ever seen. They have planes on there and memorabilia, not only from the Second World War, but they have it also from other wars. Other planes have been brought to the Midway, to the hangar deck and to the flight deck, and so there's a lot of things that are interesting there. In fact, they have my set of semaphore flags with my name on it and the date and so forth as part of the memorabilia. The discharge that I received was in 1946. In those days we enlisted for the duration of the war plus 6 months. That was the way our enlistment read. When I was on the ship, before I was on the ship, I wrote home at least once a week, and my mother wrote a letter to me at least once a week, sometimes 2 or 3 times, and told me about the news of the little hometown and sent me the little weekly paper. And at the end of every one of her letters, she always included 2 or 3 jokes. jokes that she'd heard in the restaurant from customers. The waitresses and everybody in the restaurant would tell jokes to the customers. And so when I got a letter and we had mail call, the guys would always say, "Hey, Whitey, read us the jokes at the end of your mother's letter." It was a lot of fun for everybody. And when I got out of the service, I went into the ministry. I was working the first job I think the first job I had other than our restaurant was in a bakery. I was going to learn to be a baker, and the funny thing was that I couldn't sleep in the daytime, had to work at nighttime, and I couldn't sleep in the daytime. So this was 1946, and there was, I went to church all the time. Even when I was a kid, all the guys that enlisted or were drafted, I would take their place. A lot of us younger guys take their place, be ushers in the church and so forth. And the thing about lying there on the cot in the basement, because Illinois is very hot and sultry in the summertime, and I put a cot down in the basement, and I would try to read myself to sleep. And the minister at our church gave me a New Testament, which was in modern English, not King James Version. And the Revised Standard Version, I started reading the New Testament. And the more I read, the more I said to myself, there's got to be a better way than having war and killing each other. And that's the main reason that I went into the ministry. I found out, of course, that even a religion like the Christian religion is not going to stop wars, because there's people that they won't adhere to things like the Golden Rule, treating other people the way you want to be treated and so forth. And so I went into the ministry, and then when I left the ministry, I didn't retire. I left the ministry and moved to California. I went to, incidentally, when I got out of the Navy, I was a musician, and I went to a music conservatory. So I studied classical music there, and I played in symphony orchestra, concert band, marching band, and some small groups. And also I sang in the men's chorus, the mixed chorus, and was a singer in those days. I'm not much of a singer now, but I whistle all the time. I continually whistle the dance music, the swing and jazz music, and drives everybody crazy. My wife, when we go into a store, if she can't find me wandering around, she'll listen, and she hears me whistling, and she can find me. So that's one of my habits, I guess. And my greatest pleasure is, I think, is not only listening to music and going to hear live music, but I have photographed dozens and dozens of musicians, famous musicians. So I have quite a library of music and photographs. I went to, when I got out, I had to go to college first to get a degree before I could be ordained as a minister. And so I went to college at the Illinois Wesleyan, which was not very far, about 25 miles from my hometown. And I got my bachelor's degree there. And then I went to the University of Wisconsin, and I went to University of Illinois and for more experience and studying for, at the University of Illinois, I started studying for the theater, drama, acting, stagecraft, directing, screenwriting, and so forth. And so then after I got my bachelor's, while I was going to seminary, Garrett Seminary, which is north of Chicago, and then I also started doing graduate work in those other schools. And I eventually ended up in California, and I went to the University of California to film school to study more formally everything that needs to be learned about film, video, television, and movies. So that has all been interesting. Today, of course, like I said, I'm 87. I'm retired, but I'm still a jazz fan. And I have a huge jazz collection in my studio, my study. Oh, two of the most important things in my life was getting married to Jane Danhoff, who was from Washburn, Illinois, a little town near Peoria. And so we've been married now almost 65 years. And our daughter is Camille. She lives in Camarillo, which is only 15 miles from us. And our son Randy graduated from Buena High School in Ventura and went to college on a full scholarship. And coming home 3 months later, Christmas time, he was killed. Well, this sounds like me being a writer. It sounds like something that I made up. Something was fiction, but this is a true story. Jane was going to the university in Normal, Illinois, which was Illinois State, and I was going to school in the Music Conservatory in Decatur, Illinois, which is about 40 miles or so, 60 miles south of there. And I had 4 friends that we were friends growing up when we were kids. And after the service, all 4 of us were discharged, and we were still friends, and we ran around together all the time. So I think all of us were probably somewhere around 20, 19, 20, 21, 22. And we were out on the town, going out on the town one night, the 4 of us. And one of the guys said, "You know, I made a mistake. I got a date with 2 different girls for tomorrow night, Sunday night, and I can't see both of them. One of them's in Peoria and the other one's in Normal." And I said, "Well, that's easy to solve. Why don't you just cancel the date, break the date with the girl in Normal?" And in fact, we were in Normal at the moment. And I said, "Break the date with her and go with the date in Peoria, because you got to go to Peoria to go back to Bradley to the university tomorrow anyway." And so he said, "Well, okay." And we pulled up in front of the house where Jane lived. 6 girls, I think, lived in a home. Lady rented rooms to students, college students. And he went in to break the date, and he was gone probably 10 minutes, and we thought it was too long. So somebody said, "Someone go in there and get him." So I said, "Okay, I will." So I went up on the porch and looked into the door that was open into the living room, and the 2 of them, Jane and Charlie, were talking. And I said, "Come on, we're going to take off." So he left. I don't know if he even introduced me to him. to his date, ex-date. And So the next day, I wanted to go to a concert down there. And one of the other fellows, he was older than, a year older than the rest of us. He'd been married, and his wife divorced him while he was in the service. And so he said, boy, I'd love to go with Jane Solomon, the Presbyterian preacher's daughter. But he said, he'd kill me if she went with a divorced guy. And divorce was a dirty word in those days. So anyway, I said, well, she's a good friend of mine. I'll call her and get a date for you with her to go to the concert. So she said, oh, I'd love to go with him. I've been wanting to go with Johnny Cable for a long time. And she said, of course I'm going to go. And I said, well, you can't tell your father because he may object. And she said, it'll be on the QT. And I said, incidentally, I want to go to the concert too. Do you have anyone that lives there with you that likes music? And she says, oh yeah. She said, got Marty. I'd seen Marty. She was a great looking gal. I said, oh, that'd be good. I said, now wait a minute. Chickie canceled a date with another girl there, and I don't know what her name is. Do you know her? Oh yeah, that's Jane Danhoff. She's a musician also, like you. And I said, would she like to go to the concert? And she said, I don't know, I'll ask her. So she put her on the phone. And I said, you want to go to the concert tonight, Sunday night? And she said, oh, I'd love to. And said, who am I talking to? And I said, well, the guy that came and got the chickie out of the house was breaking a date with you last night. And she says, wonderful. So Johnny and I took the girls, we were both making money in those days, and so we took them to one of the best restaurants that existed in central Illinois, and then took them to the concert. And afterward, we went to the ice cream parlor, which was famous in that town, and we had a funny Sunday. The ice cream parlor had great names for all of their things, their dishes that they had, and one of them was called a Funny Sunday. I don't remember what was in it anymore, but I remember there was whipped cream and a maraschino cherry on top. And Jane says, oh, I wish they'd put 3 cherries on there. She loved maraschino cherries and still does. And so then we took the girls home. And it was probably still early. I don't know, it was probably midnight, maybe 12 o'clock. And so we're sitting in the car in front of the house to take them in. And I said, oh, how about another date? And Jane says, well, this Christmas vacation starts in 2 days, and I'll be home in Washburn, and the family will probably have all kinds of family things planned, and I don't know what's going to go on. And I said, okay, I'd just like to have another date with you sometime because I'm going to marry you. And she laughed hysterically. And so we took the girls up to the door and told them good night. And I told one of my roommates back in my college, which was 40 miles away, I said, I met a girl that is really interesting, and I'm interested in her. And I got the mail about 15 minutes later, and there was a note in there inviting me to a dance at her school with a big band, Dick Jurgens' band. Well, I wanted to go hear the band, but I said, you know, she didn't seem to be interested in another date, so I don't think I'll go. And this guy, Ed, said, another Ed, said, well, if I were you, I'd go, because you seem to be really hung up on her. So I wrote her back, and I accepted the date, and I went to see her then sometime in January. And 14th of January, I just remembered the date. We met on December the 12th. And then a month later, I went to the dance, and 2 months later, in April, I gave her a diamond, and then we were married almost a year to the day after we met, on December the 22nd in 1949. And like I may have said, we've been married 65 years this year. She's my first wife, and I'm glad I never had to worry about getting married again. So that's pretty much the crazy story of how we met. Sounds like fiction, like somebody made it up, but it's true. Incidentally, I remember keeping touch with 3 friends all those years. Bob Washington in Pittsburgh, Dick Sweet in Newport, Rhode Island, and Van Blanchard in Canton, Ohio. In fact, after we got married, we visited those guys. And so that is the main thing I think about the service. When I got out, I joined the American Legion in the 40 and 8, which my dad was a member of. And I have an interesting thing my daughter did. She made shadow boxes, I guess you call them, for my military service. One of the boxes is probably 2.5 feet long and has the big long picture in it of my company in the boot camp. 200, almost 300 guys in the formation, and she put in there pictures of me in uniform, and also pictures of my dad in World War I and his service caps. So those are kind of interesting memorabilia in our little museum upstairs in our guest bedroom. As far as the military is concerned, I think I said earlier that I really enjoyed the Navy, and I enjoyed, of course, being on an aircraft carrier. The military really did something valuable for me. Being a kid, going in when I was 17, being a kid, we didn't have too many worries. Everything was pretty much provided for us by our parents, by the little town and so forth. I didn't know what discipline was. I didn't know what planning was. In the military, you're very disciplined, as you know, from the very first day, the first minute you're in there. You learn what discipline is and how valuable it is, especially in the military, because you have so many friends and other people that are in there that you have to take care of them and they have to take care of you. Everybody takes care of each other in the military. You depend on your buddies. And so I learned discipline, I think, although I'm pretty well undisciplined today, especially since I'm retired. But that was a valuable lesson, I believe. I may not have learned that in college later on, or any other time or any other experiences. So that was, I think, was one of the main things that maybe most of us learned in the military. Number two, the military pretty well takes care of you. It's not like a job that you have as a civilian where you might, in most cases, you will plan what you want to do. Sometimes you're sort of unplanned, and so the military helped you with organizing things. You had to get organized and be organized. So I learned that. I don't know if I would have learned it as well, maybe until I got married. Your wife helps you with a lot of those things, or if a woman, a husband, and many times children. You learn an awful lot from your children. But it helped you, I think, to know how to be a married person, to be a father or a mother, and how to help your children. Discipline your children with love, not force, to discipline to the point where they want to do things properly. I have here a book. Being a writer, I buy a lot of these stenographer books, and they're the greatest thing in the world to write. I have notes in these. This one, I put on the front of it, memoirs. And somebody, a long time ago, several years ago, said, "You had an interesting life. How come you don't write an autobiography?" And I said, "Nobody's interested in my life. It's not that interesting to other people. I'm not a celebrity. I'm not a famous person." Well, you know, what if your family sometimes, your daughter or grandchildren, want to know something about you? Wouldn't it be good to write it down? So I started writing my memoirs. They're not organized or anyway. They're just thoughts that I come up with when I'm thinking, driving, doing exercise, sitting, watching TV, reading, listening to music, and something pops into my head, and so I flip it open and I write a headline at the top of the page, and then later on I can fill it in. And the first page in my memoir, and this is what I'm going to call it. I won't have it published unless it's self-published or something. But the first page in my memoir is going to be the title, "My Dad Never Taught Me Anything." Now, isn't that something? He never taught me anything. He didn't have to set my sister or me down and say, "This is what's right, this is what's wrong. This is the way you treat people, this is the way you don't treat people." He didn't have to do any of that. Didn't have to say, "This is about the birds and the bees this way. This is all about sex," and so forth. So my mother and dad never did that. Never talked to us about any of those things. They were both perfect role models. We learned all of those things by watching them, listening to them, watching what they did with other people, how they treated other people, and how they treated each other. We learned it all by watching and listening. So they didn't have to sit us down and teach us a lesson. My dad never taught me anything. Okay? Everybody in town probably with the exception of maybe 2 or 3 people, were role models for kids. That's one of the greatest things I think that could ever happen to a child, is to be raised in that kind of an atmosphere. I wish it were like that today. I think I omitted saying that I'm a plank owner of the Midway, the aircraft carrier. A plank owner in the Navy was the first crew of any ship when the ship was new. And the first crew, they said, we owned the ship. Well, our ownership is a plank from the deck of the ship. Now, the aircraft carriers, as maybe most of you know that'll be viewing these things, the decks were made of wood years ago. They usually were made of old things like teak wood. So the Midway doesn't have a wooden deck. It's the first ship that had a steel deck. The deck is 3.5 inches of solid steel, and the flight deck, that's the flight deck, and the hangar deck underneath where you store planes and work on planes is another 3.5 inches of solid steel. So if you wanted to take your plank from the ship when it's decommissioned, you would not be able to use a saw. You'd have to use a real cutting torch. So I'm a plank owner, however, of the Midway, and I think maybe I have a certificate for it, and I have no idea where it is. But the first crew on a ship owned the ship, they said. That was your ownership to prove that you were on the crew. It is somewhere between maybe 6 and 9 inches thick. That wood, it was really planks, really logs that had been trimmed. The Franklin, Benjamin Franklin, was a small carrier, and CVE it was called, and it was hit by a kamikaze plane in the war in the Pacific, and they brought it back, and up there on top of the up top from our ship, we could look right down into the hull of the Benjamin Franklin, look down into the bowels of it, and I noticed how thick that wood was, and so that's pretty much my whole life, or the highlights of my life at least. And this is probably not going to be on this, but I want to thank Ed Lynch for taking the time, and with his experience and everything, of doing this for veterans for the Library of Congress. It's a marvelous thing that he's doing, and I just want to thank him publicly for that.